Welcome to the ADHD Women's Wellbeing podcast. I'm Kate Moore-Youssef and I'm a wellbeing and lifestyle coach, EFT practitioner, mum to 4 kids and passionate about helping more women to understand and accept their amazing ADHD brains. After speaking to many women just like me and probably you, I know there is a need for more health and lifestyle support for women newly diagnosed with ADHD. In these conversations, you'll learn from insightful guests, hear new findings and discover powerful perspectives and lifestyle tools to enable you to live your most fulfilled, calm and purposeful life wherever you are on your ADHD journey. Here's today's episode. So hi everyone, welcome back to the ADHD Women's Wellbeing podcast. I'm Kate Moore-Youssef, your host as always. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have a new friend of mine, someone who I've been on his podcast and now thankfully he's come on here. His name is Alex Partridge. You may know him as ADHD Chatter. He's fantastic. He's created an amazing podcast and I have been really looking forward to having Alex on the podcast. Now, if you don't know who he is one of the pioneers of social media content the way we know it today. And at the age of 21, he founded UNILAD and Lad Bible, two of the most popular social news and entertainment internet companies in the world with an astonishing following of 100 million people around the globe. And now at 34 years old, Alex was diagnosed with ADHD and has quickly become a leading voice on social media around neurodiversity. His impassioned views on entrepreneurship and neurodiversity has quickly amassed him a following of over 500,000 people. I'm absolutely delighted to have you here, Alex. Thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you so much. It's really surreal actually, because that was about 11 months ago. I was considering whether or not I should get assessed for ADHD, and I was binging this podcast, your podcast. So to now be a guest on it is a real surreal moment. So thank you so much for the invite.
Well, you know, Alex, I remember getting that message from you on, I think it was LinkedIn, and you sent me a message saying, you know, I'm starting this podcast and I'd love you, for you to come on and, talk about it. And obviously, I don't get that many requests from, to be on male podcasts because obviously my audience is mostly women. And I was like really intrigued and excited. And then I looked at your bio and I was like, oh my God, he's the Lad Bible guy and he wants me on his podcast. So I was equally, excited and just really inspired to hear your story, your personal story. Now, we've actually met in real life, which was such an ADHD moment because just for a quick backstory, I think we were messaging backwards and forwards, and I don't even think you knew where I lived. And you said you were coming really nearby to do an event. You were speaking at an event. And within a couple of hours, we'd organised for me to come and collect you, take you to the train station and have a chat and a dog walk and a coffee. And we did it. It was like, ridiculously impulsive, but I'm so glad that we did that because, in this space, we don't often meet each other in real life, and just have had that kind of like hour where we chatted and connected. And I can't wait to share your wisdom and your experience and what you've got to offer. I kind of said to you off camera that I wanted this almost to be like a bit of a mentoring session to anyone that feels that they would love to create their own entrepreneurial journey, but feel a little bit kind of blocked by their neurodiversity. And I wonder if you're able to share a little bit of your backstory as obviously a hugely successful person in, entrepreneurship, in social media, what you were able to achieve at the age of 21. But on the flip side, like when did you start noticing these signs or these traits that you felt perhaps were holding you back? There was self-sabotage and you were struggling.
Well, I think anxiety has always been a major comorbidity. I now know what that word is. Looking back into my really early years, I think I was always a very anxious child. I remember sitting in the back of a classroom and very quiet, always in my head. And I remember one particular day, the teacher pointed at me and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And all of the pupils turned around and looked at me. And in that moment, my face went red. I could feel it. My palms went sweaty and my breathing got quite difficult. And I stood up and I left the classroom and I found someone in the corridor and I said, "You need to call an ambulance. I'm having a heart attack." I wasn't having a heart attack. Of course I wasn't. I was having an anxiety attack at 6 years old. I've always had that incredible racing mind that when I'm sort of forced to not allow it to come out in creative ways, then it really manifests into anxiety. And that was the first time that anxiety was mentioned when I was 6, and that was the first of many anxiety attacks. So that was, looking back, like the first real sign of something that was a bit different to everyone else.
Yeah. You know, what you talk about a lot in your social media is that you relate to how sort of this typical way ADHD shows up in girls and women. You've got a very compassionate way. And I think that you said before that typically in ADHD, you know, with boys, it's always the external, very sort of overexcitable, hyperactive way. And you didn't relate to that. So you struggle to be able to spot these signs of ADHD in yourself. And so did that anxious mind, that racing mind, that the sort of the quiet exterior carry on manifesting throughout your academic life? And I guess, how did that impact you?
I think total, I would say, in a positive way. And I always just spoke about my own ADHD experience when I started making the content, about it being internalized, and I was never physically hyperactive. It was only until I saw the feedback and the comments that it was mainly from women who related, that I realized that perhaps women were relating to my experience more than some others. I've always had it internalized. I think it has led to be very creative, and I look back and it's always the sedative to the anxiety for me was entrepreneurialism. And I remember, again, when I was 7 years old, going through my parents' board games in their house and finding out all the addresses on the cardboard boxes and making my own board game and sending it off to all of these companies. And I got a letter back from one of them after a couple of weeks, and they said, "I'm really sorry, we're not looking for any new designs at the moment, but always lean into that entrepreneurial side." So I think when I was allowed to do what I wanted to do, that racing mind turned into creativity. It was only when I was sort of stuck in a classroom or not able to channel it in positive ways that it manifested into anxiety. And then as I got a bit older and I was able to leave the school system and do what I wanted, then that's when I just relentlessly started businesses, because I knew that that was the antidote for me for the anxiety.
Yeah. And I wonder, you know, for you speaking out like this, have you had a lot of men, boys, you know, people that can really relate to the fact that they've been diagnosed with ADHD later on in life, but it actually hasn't presented in this sort of stereotypical way?
Oh yes, lots. Yeah, lots of men, women, everyone's relates to it. The feedback I got was, "Oh, that's more women relate to it because from a societal point of view, perhaps they don't act out, even if they might have hyperactive ADHD, because of the societal constraints and narratives. They sort of internalize it, and that manifests into anxiety. So perhaps there's more relatability because of that. I think that probably is the case with a lot of women." But no, just as many men, really. And I think they found it quite refreshing that somebody was framing ADHD in a different narrative than the stereotypical narrative. I think lots of men as well are similar to me in terms of we internalized it. You know, I think I wasn't the only boy sat at the back of the classroom who was very still, but
Mm,
my mind was very fast.
yeah. And that very fast mind obviously translated into, you know, like you say, creating businesses, wanting to be entrepreneurial, that almost feeling more settled the busier you were creating and being kind of forward thinking. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Alex, in his late teens? You were at university, am I right? That you'd got to university and your head wasn't in the university game, it was in creating businesses. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think just to add a bit of context, you've probably got to go back 2 years. So after I left college, I was adamant that I didn't want to go to university because I associated anything educational with that classroom experience, and I almost had like this phobia of going back into that environment. So I didn't go to university straight away. I stayed in my hometown and I set up a business. It was a website where if you didn't know what to buy your loved ones for their birthday, you would come onto my website, input their interests, and my website would suggest some presents which you could then buy them. And this was my first kind of big business, but it was also my first experience of the boom and bust cycle, where I had really heavily invested time, money into creating this website, and then waking up one day and my interest for it had just disappeared, or it was a gradual process. But I remember the day where I really realized that I had absolutely no motivation towards that, and that was the first of two. In my second year after that, I repeated that cycle. And it was actually after that having happened twice that my confidence in my own entrepreneurial ability was on the floor, because I had these two huge failures behind me. So I thought, okay, I like entrepreneurialism, but I'm really bad at it. Because I've started these two businesses and then I've just given up on them, abandoned them because my interest has disappeared. And I just thought that was normal. So I applied to go to university. In my first year of university, I started another business. And my third business, it was a late night pizza delivery company. I impulsively spent all of my student loan on a huge 6-foot freezer, filled it with frozen pizzas, set up a Facebook page. And if you were a student and you wanted a pizza in the middle of the night, you would text me, I would throw it in the oven. I had 4 people cycling around Oxford delivering these pizzas to students. But again, my interest for that idea disappeared. And so that was the third time that had happened. In my second year, that's when things got a bit more exciting. I entered into a relationship, and she was the editor of a digital magazine in the university. And to cut a very long story short, the relationship didn't work. And my very sort of problem solving brain was thinking, how could I make her think that we had something in common? So I started something similar to what she was doing, and that's what started UNILAD. And that was in my second year of university in 2010. I sort of registered the name, and that was really the start of my social media journey.
It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to hear this, because I can almost like hear the cogs whirring, and I can see like you're joining dots, you're noticing gaps in market, niches. Like that's why I just love neurodivergent brains, because something just clicks into place and we see something and then we act on it. And that impulsive side of us is what often gets us into, being incredible entrepreneurs. But then on the flip side, like you say, it's soul destroying, and it's like our self-belief is just on the floor when we just wake up that next morning and the dopamine's gone and we lose interest. But knowing now what you know about ADHD and looking back at that self, like, now that you have got more of a retrospective understanding, what would you have done differently in those situations? Like, obviously, with the businesses, certain businesses are meant to be, we have to kind of have these little stepping stones and breadcrumbs to get us to the different places. Any entrepreneur that we speak to, anyone from, Bill Gates to Bezos to anyone, they had lots of different businesses before until they get to that sort of jackpot. But what would you say to anyone that is going through this right now? And I've had it as well, of where you just lose interest. Do you think it's a matter of like you lacked support, you weren't delegating, you were trying to do everything and not being an expert at anything? Like, what would you say looking back?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely just went too fast into all of them. But when you're in that moment of excitement and your motivation is there, like that hyper focus for me was a great ability. And when my excitement for all of those 3 businesses was there, then they actually achieved a lot. I went from nothing to having 4 people delivering pizzas in Oxford within about a week. I went from nothing to having a successful website selling stuff with an affiliation with Amazon within about a week and a half. That hyper focus is a tremendous strength. I just didn't have the awareness to take my foot off the accelerator and take a real introspective think and say, is this business actually something I'm intrinsically interested in doing in the long term? And the answer to all of those 3 was no, but I didn't know that at the time. So once the honeymoon period had passed, and we had to get into the harder, the more mundane stuff, that was me done. I'm off, business abandoned. So what would I do differently? Well, I would say this to anyone now. Whenever you have an impulsive excitement moment, is try and put some space between that trigger, that moment of excitement, and taking action. And I'm fully aware. Gosh, I'm aware that's easier said than done, because when you're in that moment, you don't want anyone to tell you to have a breather. You want to do it now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
that's what I would do. I would shelf the idea. I would put it on the shelf, my shelf of ideas. And if I'm still looking over my shoulder at that idea in a week or 2 weeks, and I've really thought about, okay, in 2 weeks' time, once I've bought the domain and I've done the branding and I've got to do the boring stuff like hire an accountant and apply for a trademark or whatever, am I still going to be interested in it? I went too fast into all of those ideas. I didn't have the self-awareness either to know that I wasn't interested in those ideas intrinsically. I'm always interested in a rush of dopamine, which any new idea gives me, whether that's a car washing business or if I decided to become an accountant, I would get a flood of dopamine in that during that honeymoon period, whatever it is on the planet. But what actually intrinsically interests me, very small number of things. I just didn't know what they were at the time. So doing self-awareness exercises as well, I think that's fundamentally key to having success in business in any area, especially when you have ADHD, like, because we all get excited in the early stages of anything. But once that honeymoon period, does it really excite us intrinsically? Does it really connect with us? Very few things do with me. And I think that's the same for a lot of people. So finding out what those are, and ensuring that the new business ideas align with those. Because once the honeymoon period passes and you've got to sit in a room for 3 hours and do a tax return or reply to 20 emails from disgruntled clients, you've got to love what you're doing, or there's got to be an intrinsic connection between that business and your interests. Otherwise, you'll quit at that point.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. It makes me laugh because there's so many memes going around, aren't there? The amount of domain names that so many of us have registered, when we get that dopamine rush of like, oh my God, it's an amazing business idea. And I must have hundreds of business ideas that I've literally been like, oh my God, I'm registering the domain for, or had conversations with. And I've now learned that some of these business ideas are just not meant for me, they're for someone else. So my friends who actually don't even want to set up their own business, I've been like, have you thought about doing this? Because I think you'd be really good at it. So I just like hand some of these business ideas over just so they can get some traction. If, there's a possibility that they might come out into the world in some capacity. But I also think that, we have these ideas for a reason, but we might not have to be that person on the ground doing all the mundane stuff. And if there's a way that we can strategically, get help, and get some support in those different ways. And I always sort of say, the first thing for me was getting an assistant, and that assistant for me has done a lot of those mundane tasks that I know my business would never get to this point now of carrying on doing the things that I do if I wasn't able to drop her an email and say, please, can you look at this? There's a glitch on the website. There's a problem with the mailing system, because there's no way I would be able to do that. So I knew from a very early stage, I had to take a hit financially and pay for my assistant who's helped me grow my business. So anyone that's, listening now is, don't do all that mundane stuff yourself if you know that's going to be your massive block, that's going to prevent you from taking things forward. But at the same time, exactly what you said, Alex, is like that pause and that breather to see if that really is for you. Is it for someone else? Is it just a dopamine chase? Is it just that moment where you can just register the domain, pay 30 quid or something, and just know it's there on the back burner, and see what happens? But what differentiated for you to be able to stay in it for the long haul and create your UNILAD and Lad Bible and really get it to the point where you got it? Like how did you differentiate the other ones to making those a success?
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And I've spoken to a lot of people about this and really trying to understand what it was that made my relationship with UNILAD and Lad Bible different to the other businesses that I had abandoned. And the conclusion that I've come to is that it's the landscape that I was building on social media for two reasons. And the first reason is that the platforms, Facebook, really it was just Facebook at the time, but now it's Instagram and TikTok and all the rest, they're constantly changing. They change every day. So for me, that's a mini new obsession every day to think about, okay, so what's the latest platform on this one? What's the latest change on that one? The other business ideas, they're quite static. So having that awareness for me to build on a landscape that is going to keep, that isn't going to static and it's going to have some kind of fluidity to it to keep my brain engaged. And the second thing with social media is when I post on Facebook, there's an instant feedback loop. There's an instant dopamine loop, a psychiatrist on my podcast said, and that's why he believes that's why I stuck at it. But I think really, like the main thing is that I had the resources by that stage as well to outsource the mundane bits. And I had probably had them if I was honest with myself before. Having a VA or a personal assistant, they are, I think, affordable for most people. I just didn't have the awareness to ask for one. So I learned from my first three major businesses that okay, I'm really weak at those sections. Let's find someone to help me with those. So it was a combination, I think, the sort of perfect storm of the business was on a landscape that was constantly adjusting and changing. So I didn't get the opportunity to get into that terminal boredom phase of it. And also I was delegating the boring bits out to other people who didn't struggle with those bits. So I think it was a combination of those two.
I think that's really fascinating because what you've just told me then is like almost like a formula for your success of understanding your ADHD brain, your neurodivergent brain, of knowing that there's a simplicity to what you understand, and we all understand things differently, and we all have this sort of innate way of working. And maybe social media for you was just very innate, and you just got it. And other people can get gardening or baking or I don't know, music. And then you basically recognize that if it was static, you wouldn't be interested. You know that if you had to do the same thing every single day, show up with no sort of expansion, that would kind of curtail you. That would just kind of finish you off.
Mm.
But you recognize that if there was a fluidity there, that there was going to be change and movement and growth, that for you would keep those dopamine receptors kind of like on the ball. Would you say that feels pretty accurate?
Yeah, it does. And I would add, if I was brutally honest with myself, I think the social media business, what really differentiated that from all the others is that it really played into my inherent want to please people. And because building on social media is so public, you post something and the world can see it. So when you do that and you get positive feedback, there's something deep inside me, I don't know where it comes from, that is an inherent people pleaser. And that was a key motivating factor to me. But it was that, but it was also because I had this audience that, and I actually think this is probably the major keystone that made me stick at it, was that it gave me accountability. I had a community that I had forged a relationship with. And if I didn't show up or if I didn't please them, then that would have been really painful for me. And I don't know if that's good advice or bad advice, but it's the truth. It's that I felt motivated to constantly show up to please my audience. Otherwise, I would feel like I would let them down. And I think there's a bit of confrontation avoidance in there as well. If I didn't show up or if I missed a post, then I might get a bit of feedback. It wouldn't be confrontational, but it would be like, "Oh, what happened? Where are you?" And there's a deep avoidance of that situation for me. I don't know where that comes from, but I think that's certainly a major factor which contributed to me not getting bored of the social media businesses. I don't think it was a case of me always being pulled by motivation. I think I was probably pushed by some kind of insecurity and not wanting to let down the community that I had built and not wanting to even consider getting into a confrontation, because for me, letting someone down is opening up the gates of confrontation. And so I would never risk that happen. So I turned up every day and I carried on building.
Yeah. And now, listen, you've got an amazing self-awareness of recognizing where those things, and I think you've spoken to me before about you recognizing where you overcommitted and you said yes to so many different people all the time. And now that you've got this understanding of ADHD, you know where that can come in, like you said, the people pleasing, perhaps the rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and now you are a little bit more conscious of what you say yes to and what meetings you take and what events you speak at, and knowing that you have this propensity which can perhaps be a bit of a downfall. It's really interesting. So how long has it been since you actually had your official diagnosis?
So I got diagnosed in December 2022. So it is coming up to a year,
So it's a
11 months.
year. Yeah. Okay. So, and in that year, the fact that you've been able to now make quite big changes and see almost, would you say that you can spot your ADHD a couple of steps ahead and make decisions now that are good for your mental health, are good for you, your boundaries? Are you still learning? What's changed for you?
Yeah, I think massively. Burnout is so much more obvious to me now. I was completely oblivious to it, so I just worked through it before. And if I'm entirely honest, I turned to alcohol during those moments, and that was kind of my vice. So it was a really toxic, lack of self-awareness environment where I would just work relentlessly for a month. I knew something wasn't quite working, my brain wasn't optimal, and that stressed me out. So I drank and now I know that that was most likely burnout, and I can recognize that, and I can take a step back and not turn to alcohol. I think for me, when I stop doing the little things well, that's an early sign of burnout. And I use this example. I do a lot of filming, and every single day I have to put my USB stick into my computer. And when your computer prompts you to correctly, safely remove the USB stick, I know, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but I know when I stop doing that, when I get into a frustration and I just yank out the USB, that's when the details get compromised. And for me, that's an early sign that I'm working too much and I need to have a day off, or I need to go for a walk, or I need to go for a run. Because I was completely unaware of that before. I'm lucky now in a way that I'm able to structure my work life to include lots of breaks. And I don't need to start working until about 10 o'clock every day, and I can go to bed when I want. So that's a huge contributing factor. But I think, yeah, having that awareness of burnout is completely the main issue, and also the rejection sensitive dysphoria. That I think for me is the most painful part of ADHD, in my personal life for sure, and in business. There's many reasons why a client or a podcast guest or whatever might throw you off. I'll give you an example. I was going on the train up to London to do a filming an episode of my podcast. It was a really important day, a big guest, and I got a text message in the morning from a guest that was due to come in a few weeks and say, "I'm really sorry, I can't come on your podcast anymore." And that completely derailed me. And I was sat on the train in this rage, ready to email their manager saying, why can't they come on? But now I have that awareness to go, hang on, that's not a rational response.
Mm.
There's a million reasons why it's not even your business. You don't need to know. So I breathed, and by the time I got to London, I had calmed down, and I was able to look at that text and go into the interview and have a successful day. If I hadn't done that, I probably would have texted that person and got into a really weird situation, which would have ultimately made me incredibly anxious the next day and derailed me for probably a whole week. So I think having that awareness of rejection sensitive dysphoria has been a huge game changer. And when you recognize it, and it happens every day, like some more extreme than others, having an awareness of that has really changed the outcomes, because I know I can feel it. You can feel it, and when you feel that internalized dysregulation and that rage, that you're probably dysregulated, and maybe you should just take a step away from the situation and put some time between, again, that stimulus and then the reaction, because 9 times out of 10, if you don't do that, you will say something that is going to make you ultimately very anxious in the long run and really interfere with your productivity and results. So that's having that awareness. And also in my private life with my partner, this is probably the healthiest relationship I've ever had because of that awareness of rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's been the downfall of all of my previous relationships, for sure. For me, it's the most painful part of ADHD, but also once you have an awareness of it, it's the biggest skill that has come from the diagnosis, is having that awareness and to be able to respond more proportionately to when there is a criticism in life, because they come around, for perfectly valid reasons, but now I can respond to them in a much more rational way.
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely relatable. And thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because when we discuss it, we sort of say, name it to tame it. And, just to have that recognition. I mean, the amount of times I've told someone about RSD and they've been like, what do you mean that's a thing? I'm like, yeah, that's why you feel like you do. And that's why historically, you've been impulsive, you've reacted, and you've felt like and then it's like you say, it's taken a week to get over because of all this anxiety of the way you reacted in that situation. And that moment where they kind of go, okay, so that's actually a thing. That's not just me being a terrible human, is life changing. I really do believe that. And to be able to see it and to spot it, breathe, pause, respond in a way that feels like we're not losing control of ourselves is really empowering. And when we can do that in business and we can do that in our private lives, all of a sudden, something changes, something quite big and pivotal changes in our life because we don't feel like we're being controlled by our dysregulation. Hi, so just a quick note to say, don't forget to have a look on my website, ADHDwomenswellbeing.co.uk. I am in the process of curating a fantastic library of resources for you. There's lots of free resources on there, and I've just uploaded a workshop called Protecting and Nurturing Your ADHD Energy. And this is all about how to learn how to protect your energy and prevent burnout, something I'm really passionate about. And I've got lots of things in there, like my wellbeing toolkit, helping you with lots of different EFT videos. Those are paid for and free. And my signature program, which is the ADHD hormone series, which I'm constantly adding new content to. I'm honestly so proud of this program and the feedback and the recommendations I'm getting from so many different experts, psychologists and psychiatrists and doctors recommending it, because the information in the hormone series is the most up to date, most groundbreaking out there if you are an ADHD woman and who wants to connect the dots about your health throughout the different stages in your life, and especially if you are going through hormonal challenges. I've just updated it with some brand new speakers, including Kate Shepherd-Cohen, who is a menstrual cycle support consultant, Dr. Nicola Harker, she's a self-compassion teacher and leadership coach, and really helping us understand how powerful self-compassion can be when we've had a lifetime of not really understanding ourselves. And we've just got the fantastic Victoria White, who is a birth and postnatal doula for neurodivergent women. And we've also got Laura Spence. She's an ADHD midwife and perinatal mental health support. Dr. Rachel Gow, who is a nutritional neuroscientist and neurodevelopmental specialist. She's providing lots of mood tips and brain health recipes. And I really believe that so many different workshops can really help in so many different capacities, whether you have suffered with PMDD, endometriosis, you're going through perimenopause, you've just had a baby, you're pregnant, you've got a daughter that's going through puberty. There are so many different angles to being able to support and help ourselves and advocate for ourselves as women, neurodivergent women, where hormones have a massive part to play in our neurodivergence. So that's on the website right now. And please do just go and check out the resources. I'm building them as much as I can. And I have got a new program coming out as well at the end of January. So keep an eye out on that. If you sign up to any of my free resources, you'll be on my mailing list. And whenever anything new comes out, you'll be the first to know. And you'll also be the first to get the discounted options as well. So I really hope that's been of help. And now back to today's episode. I think it's really powerful for people to hear that, and especially for you who does spend a lot of time on social media. You know, you have a huge amount of engagement, and there must be a huge amount of positivity, but the odd comment, I mean, I've had it where the odd comment and someone says something quite mean or challenges you or something like that, that really still throws me. And I kind of think, that's it, I'm like throwing it all away. I'm not doing this. It's not for me. Why would I put myself out there to do that when I'm trying to help people and someone says something mean? But now I'm able to kind of go, that's their thing. That's their thing. They're just projecting. I'm just going to carry on doing what I'm doing. And maybe, yes, I can have a conversation, but to acknowledge that their thing doesn't mean that's my thing. How do you find that? Because you are visible on social media and that's your thing and you're brilliant at it. How are you navigating that now for yourself as you create this new space with ADHD and especially the interconnection between entrepreneurship as well and doing these events that you do?
Mm. I think I'm able to look at feedback online quite objectively. It's when it rings true with something that you know to be right, I think it hurts a lot more. For example, when I used to post on UNILAD, it would get engagement based on how funny it was. And I know that, if I woke up one day and I wasn't feeling particularly on the ball and I thought, okay, I've got to post today, so I'll get something out. And then somebody would comment saying, oh, you used to be funny, mate. And because I know that's true, because I know that that post on that particular day isn't actually to the standard that I was happy to post that, but I just did it anyway, then that really hurts. If I'm genuinely happy and content with the content, and I can objectively say, okay, there's 100 comments, one person said they don't like it, but 99 people said they do, then that doesn't really get to me too much, because objectively, that person is in the minority. I think it is incredibly painful when you put a lot of effort in to a bit of content and you get a majoritively negative reaction, because that's objectively, you've been proven wrong. You thought that was a good bit of content, you put it out, and it wasn't. That's painful. I think it's just relating it to business. It's good to have that really fast feedback loop, and I think that's something I've always been aware of, especially with social media. I fail incredibly fast, and I'm able to get over that quite quickly. I don't dwell on the negativity. I'm aware that there's going to be an intense emotional reaction if I have to delete something 5 minutes after I posted it because it hasn't got the engagement that I was hoping for. But then I'm on to the next thing. It's like I'm super fast at making mistakes, and I'm super fast at learning from them. I think people with ADHD are generally really good at is that fast thinking, that inability to dwell on on an event once you've got over that initial really intense emotion, and that is there every single time, but knowing that it will pass and you're on to the next bit of content, which is the next new mini hyper focus.
Yeah, I think you've spoken about intuition before, and really understanding like intuitively what's going to land, or like you say, if you sort of post something and within a couple of minutes, if it's not that engagement, you kind of think, okay. And then would you say now that you've been almost given this permission to kind of lead more intuitively with how you progress now with work, with businesses, with how you're going to take, the next step? And almost before you answer that, I guess a precursor to that question was when you weren't working, and I know there was a period of time when the businesses were sold and you were sort of in a semi-retirement. How were you, sort of from a mental health perspective, not using that business brain that just wants to keep creating? Because we see this a lot with people who aren't able to tap into their creativity. It impacts their mental health.
Yeah, so I made the mistake of, I sold the social media companies in 2018. From anyone's perspective, certainly from my perspective, I was, celebrating, rightly so. I mean, it was a 10-year journey, and I sold it. And okay, I've retired. I don't need to work again. Ridiculous thing to say. Didn't know I had ADHD at this point, and I fell into a really dark place. And the only thing that saved me was computer games. And I've never really mentioned this before, but for about a year and a half, I didn't really leave my flat for any other reason other than to walk my dog. And if that's what retirement looks like, that was the only thing that made my brain fire up, was computer games. And I didn't leave my flat when I was played Call of Duty on my Xbox for a year and a half. And I suddenly realized a year and a half had gone past, because every year the game does like a Halloween special. And I remember sat on my computer and the Halloween special had come around again. And I was thinking, wow, a year has just gone past and I haven't done anything. And because of that, I felt I had that want for more. And yeah, that was probably, I don't like to throw around the word depression, but I think that was a slow and steady decline into it. And it wasn't until I actually realized that I was in it that I realized I was in it, if that makes sense. Just really, really dark, didn't leave my flat, dragging myself out to walk the dog, not really engaging, communicating with anyone. And my brain was just completely unstimulated. Like computer games, and I don't know the science, but that I was just almost addicted to this computer game. It was really bizarre, and I pulled myself up, and I thought I've got to do something, and I got this new idea to start a podcast, and it was going to be a business podcast, and it was one of those mad moments where I took my bed apart, I turned my bedroom downstairs into a soundproof studio, spent a small fortune on cameras. I hired a producer, I hired a director. I sent emails to every sort of high profile person I could think of, luckily, a few of them replied, booked them all to come down to Brighton. And then by the time all of the expensive cameras had arrived at my flat, I didn't want to do the podcast anymore. And I was just sat there in my PJs, taking 20 cardboard boxes off this postman with absolutely zero enthusiasm. I remember sat there and just feeling this hopelessness. Like, what on earth has happened? The contrast between how I'm feeling now, which is just nothing. I look at those boxes and there's not an ounce of excitement compared to what I was experiencing 3 nights ago when I ordered them, which was I was up till 4 a.m, ordering it all, DMing everyone, couldn't sleep because I was so excited. Anyway, long story short, the guy I hired to produce the show said, "So when did you get your ADHD diagnosis?" And I looked at him and I thought, "What do you mean? I've never," and he recognized the behavior and he said, oh, I just assumed you had ADHD because this is kind of classic behavior. And that's what set me on the path to learning more about ADHD and then getting assessed about 6 months later. But yeah, going through that process of, I didn't think I would ever be depressed. And it's not until I actually found myself being depressed that I recognized that I was. For me, it was just not leaving my flat, not really communicating with anyone, not really doing anything. And my brain just almost went into hibernation in the worst way possible. And so when I had that idea to start this new podcast, it just fired up almost in like 10 times the amount of overdrive that it normally does in a hyperfocus. And I massively overcommitted to this project. Lost a huge amount of time, lost a lot of money having to sell all of that stuff. But it's what opened the doors to awareness that my brain might work a bit differently. And that's what led me to get assessed and diagnosed. So, it's a funny story, really, in hindsight, talking about setting up that podcast and losing interest in it. But at the time, yeah, I remember just sat there in tears on my bed looking at all these boxes. My bed had been ripped apart. I had soundproofed my bedroom, and now I didn't want to do it anymore. It was a feeling of hopelessness that I'd never experienced before.
Yeah. From your perspective, is the podcast feeding that purpose within you? And do you have any kind of next stages, next steps? Like what's the next step for you? Or are you just happy where you are right now?
Yeah, no, it definitely is feeding that purpose within me. And I wasn't sure if it would long term or if it was going to be a short term obsession like the others. So I didn't commit to it financially or resource for the first 25 episodes. I did 25 episodes virtually from my flat, minimal spend. And I realized that the intrinsic motivation was there. And I think it was there because when I got told by a psychiatrist that my ADHD was clear as hell, it was such a contrast to what I believed ADHD to be. There was one boy when I was at school who was openly diagnosed with ADHD, and he was very stereotypically sort of very hyperactive, and that was what I thought ADHD would be. So when a psychiatrist was explaining to me that there was this other type, I just felt like that was my new mission, to learn as much about ADHD as possible, because I realized how little I actually knew. And I wanted to speak to as many people as possible. And because I wasn't doing anything, I had the time, I thought, well, let's just make the conversations public. So that was the podcast. I think the way that what's kept me interested in it is very similar to what happened with the social media businesses, is that it's actually on social media, like the landscape is on social media for me. And each guest is a new mini hyperfixation to obsess over. So even though the podcast is grown, it's really just made up of mini hyperfixations, building blocks. Each episode is like a mini business for me. It's a new person to get excited about. It's a new person to deep dive and to really get obsessed over. And then I interview them, I say goodbye, and then it's on to the next. And actually, so each episode is like a mini business for me, and they just all add together to make a big business. And I think that's so key with anyone with ADHD, is trying to find out a way to really separate a big daunting business into mini bricks. Whether that's a good analogy or not, but I think you sort of get what I'm going at. And then they all stack up to make the bigger business, and which keeps that interest. So yeah, it's definitely maintained my interest. What's next? I just keep going. Just keep going. I haven't got an end goal with it. Just keep going as long as I wake up. That's my biggest fear, is waking up and being like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. Because now I have committed financially. I've gone up to London. I've got a studio. I have a crew now, and I'm 6 months in, all this kind of stuff. So that's my biggest fear, is waking up and going, oh no, I'm dragging myself. I'm dragging myself to my computer. I'm dragging myself through this research, because that's fatal. I've found out in the past, but it hasn't happened. And actually, weirdly, amazingly, it's going the other way. As time goes on, I'm more excited to find someone new to bring on. I'm more excited to go up to London to do another day's of filming. And I think it's because the community is getting bigger. It's the same thing that happened with the social media stuff. I have a community now, like you do with this podcast. You have a community, you see the feedback in real time, you post out an episode, you see people's gratitude, you see people learning in real time. And I think as time goes on, perhaps, I'll meet my community, I'll be able to shake their hand, I'll be able to give them a hug. And it just reinforces that accountability and that people-pleasing element to me, to see the messages that I get, and you'll get with this podcast. I think that's definitely what keeps me going, to building that community and not wanting to let them down. And that really is paramount. And also the burnout, because aside from all of that, burnout is powerful, and that is something to really be aware of. And there have been mornings where I've woken up and I can sort of I felt not quite as compelled to go upstairs and go on my computer as I normally do. So super in line and aware of those mini feelings now when they do happen, and they happen about once a week or once a fortnight. I go for a longer dog walk, or I avoid coffee that day, or I go for a run, or I actually just have the whole day off. And more often than not, you do that and I come back. But it's that community and knowing that I've got this support. Some of them are cheering, some of them are just listening silently, but I know they're there because I can see the engagement, and to know that it's having a real life impact on a massively underserved community still. I think that's definitely what is keeping my interest and will keep my interest into the future.
Yeah. I think what's happening in this landscape is that so many people are still undiagnosed, and we think there's this been huge boom with ADHD, and there has. But actually, I think it's much more common. They say it's like 1 in 5, 20% of the population. But then they say 20% of the population doesn't even know that they're neurodivergent. And so there's this situation where actually being neurodivergent is much more common. It shows up in different ways. But to have these conversations that you and I are having in our different communities, but also bringing in the well-being aspect, the burnout, the business side, like really understanding how it's sort of like this full circle. So I feel like, with you've got so much more to offer, like so much more to give. Like this is just the beginning. I genuinely can see like you doing great things in this community, and it's so exciting to watch. It's great to be part of it. And I think, there's a lot of people that you're helping a huge amount. And, if you've done all this in a year, I'm excited to see what's to come. So I just wanted to thank you. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. Thank you for sharing your story, which I know will be, really relatable. But I know it's not easy as well to kind of go there and talk about lots of different things. And hopefully it's given you a bit of an opportunity, because, with your podcast, you're asking everyone all the questions and no one gets to hear your story as much. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
No, well, thank you so much for the invite, Kate. It was it was an honour, and thank you so much. I think if I was to add just one thing at the end, I think is that you mentioned the word shame, and I just wanted to add one thing. I've really removed a lot of shame since my diagnosis, and the tools that I use to stay organised, and I can see the results, the trajectory of my outcomes in business has gone up massively. For example, I always used to think that I had to use my electronic calendar on my phone because that's what adults do, and actually I have that awareness now that I'm really bad at looking at my phone, because if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So I have this huge colourful whiteboard in my desk now, which everything's color coded, and that's really, really helped me stay organized. You mentioned shame, and I just wanted to throw that in there. the tools that I use and a lot of people with ADHD perhaps need are quite contradictory to what we're told we should be using in order to do certain things in life. And actually, a lot of the stuff that's designed for people to do stuff doesn't work for me. So I have to do stuff my own way. And there's no shame in doing stuff, even if it might look a little bit silly. If it works for you, it works for you.
It's really powerful to see that. And the more we spot it, we say it, I really believe that when we give it a voice, it lessens it all and it takes it all down. So we just kind of have to keep talking and communicating. And your podcast, my podcast, lots of other podcasts out there, are doing this. And so thank you so much. And I hope we will speak again very soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate.
I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did and it resonated with you, I would absolutely love it if you could share on your platforms or maybe leave a review and a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please do check out my website, adhdwomenswellbeing.co.uk, for lots of free resources and paid for workshops. I'm uploading new things all the time and I would absolutely love to see you there. Take care and see you for the next episode.